Welcome to the DC McAllister podcast. Today I'm going to be talking about bitchiness and conservatism's fate in the culture war. When liberal writer Gore Vidal called William F. Buckley Jr. a crypto-Nazi during a televised debate in 1968, the political leader who built the modern conservative movement responded in fury. Now listen, you queers, stop calling me a crypto-Nazi or I'll sock you in your goddamn face and you'll stay plastered. The world was shocked. Buckley was ashamed. Vidal was delighted. No one lost his job. Vidal later described the incident as a trap he had carefully laid for Buckley. All in all, I was pleased with what happened, he wrote. I had enticed the cuckoo to sing its song, and the melody lingers on. Those who watched it with mouths hanging open lamented that it was an example of how excessive bitchery can get out of hand. We would say bitchiness today. Buckley pondered why, in his words, quote, faggotry is okay, but the imputation of it, discreditable. It's like saying about somebody that he is impious, which is unfriendly, even though, as everybody knows, explicit impiety is perfectly okay. ABC's response was to slap Buckley on the wrist and tell him to behave better next time. That was 1968. In 2019, excessive bitchiness, getting out of hand, is a daily occurrence on Twitter, even for conservatives who are supposed to exude self-control and godliness. I'm a conservative writer, and I'm in the midst of these cultural battles all the time, but I know firsthand, just like Buckley, what having a moment of excessive bitchiness is like, especially in the midst of a baiting game. And like Buckley, I'm ashamed of it. I apologized for it, but unlike him, I was fired from my job because of it, hounded from my position as a contributor at the Daily Wire and the Federalist because I was a liability branded with the black spot of the latest phobia. If there's one thing that's evident in these times, conservatives are painfully phobia-phobic. One could argue, of course, that I'm no Buckley, and I make no claim to be. But difference in status and ability does not excuse bad behavior or the consequences of it. In fact, the presence of greater qualities calls for greater accountability. One could also argue that these are different times, but I'll explain why Buckley's broader analysis of what happened in that debate applies very much to today and should serve as a wake-up call to principled conservatives. First, a little bit of background for those of you who might have missed it. After a week of being deluged with hate by a Twitter mob that was stirred into a frenzy in response to my criticism of The View, I know, evidently you can't criticize them, and the mistaken assumption that I had personally attacked co-host Meghan McCain, which I hadn't, I began to notice a trend in the barrage of tweets and messages. Most were from homosexuals who delighted in the drama and the meme of, "You were at my wedding, Denise," McCain's defensive response to a perceived slight. The attacks were also mixed with mockery of my writings about masculinity and femininity. This latter focus was probably due to the fact that Twitter creates this array of targets as we post ideas one after another, creating even more opportunities for lobbing bombs. In the midst of the View flood, I posted 2 tweets, one in which I responded to a study that found women's unhappiness at an all-time high, and another that described a joking interaction between my husband and me for the purpose of making a point about male and female relationships. In the former, I wrote, I can explain the unhappiness of women very simply. Women are unhappy because they are not living according to their designed purpose as human beings, as females, and as individuals. They have exchanged their unique purpose as women for equity with men and have found only misery. The latter tweet, involving my husband, I said, women need to respect a man's space, and I used an example of interrupting my husband while he watched a close basketball game. He responded, "Woman, you know better than that." It was a joke, said in fun, and I knew my Twitter followers would get my sense of humor when discussing masculinity, which they did. The mob, however, saw it as an opportunity and swarmed. Many still part of the initial The View wave. One liberal journalist, Yashar Ali, who had poked and mocked me during the View controversy, jumped onto my masculinity tweet implying that my husband was abusing me. This is particularly offensive not only because it is a lie, The only thing my husband has been fighting is cancer for the last 2 years. But men are too often accused of abuse when expressing traditional masculinity. It happens all the time. And it so easily rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Simple masculine interaction is called abusive. Men don't even know how to be anymore without being called an abuser. It's one of the assumptions the American Psychological Association's guidelines on how to treat boys and men has. They say traditional masculinity is abusive and toxic. Ali's Twitter followers knew exactly what he was saying, as well as his later criticism of my sexuality by pondering my preferred sexual positions. There was nothing really benign about it. Following Ali's tweets, as often happens when blue-checked accounts make a leading comment, the mob harassed me with death threats, mockery of my sexual relationship with my husband, and of course, like I said, falsely accusing my husband of abusing me. You know, maligning me, a public figure, is one thing, but maligning a private citizen, a good man, who's a father, a brother, or husband, and accusing him of cruelty, that's unacceptable, and it's infuriating. This was even more disturbing because the lies weren't being spread by mere internet trolls and bots, but by other conservative writers. Some might say a person should expect such a reaction when posting personal things on the internet. But this momentary vulnerability is no excuse for abuse or false accusations, and it does not negate the need to challenge the abusers. We often lament how people are harassed and abused on social media, some even driven to suicide. These aren't times to turn a blind eye to this kind of behavior, this kind of treatment of people, no matter who they are. So in response, my rage flared. Like Buckley, I turned on the initiator of the lies and verbally attacked him where I thought it would hurt, just as I had been. I told him that he didn't understand his designed and true purpose as a masculine human being, but instead sought meaning up another man's asshole. Yeah, crudely and offensively describing his homosexual relationship. When the red haze of my anger faded, I knew what I had done and how I had wronged Ali in my anger. I felt very much the harsh chill of my own words as they echoed and reverberated throughout the media into my personal life. After Buckley's outburst in 1968, he wrote in Esquire, "Certainly what happened rocked me, and I'm impelled to write about it, to discover its general implication, if any, to meditate on some of its personal implications, which are undeniable and profound, to probe the question whether it was said under the circumstances in which it was said, has any meaning at all beyond that which is most generally ascribed to it, namely, excessive bitchery can get out of hand." I'll do the same thing. For decades, conservatives have been in a culture war with a leftist ideology that pits one identity group against another, all to delegitimize and stigmatize those who hold traditional views about our nation's founding, about morality, about sexuality, about relationships. One of those traditional views is the family. Foundational to the family is the relationship between a man and a woman, between the masculine and feminine as created by God, not as we imagine it to be according to our subjective perceptions. Our identity is designed for a divine purpose. An integral part of our identity is our sexuality. That sexual identity is molded by our Maker, not socially constructed by us, other human beings, or even religious institutions. We are created by God as males or females to be in a sexual relationship with the opposite sex, unless you're called to being single. But in that relationship with the opposite sex is to procreate, complement each other in love, to keep each other company, and become one flesh as we are spiritually one in God through Christ. Conservatives either believe in the objective design of sexuality or they don't. If they don't, they've already lost the culture war. Many on the right, however, still do hold to these principles. I've heard from them. Liberal ideologues don't agree with them, of course. They see the family as self-defined, sexuality as a self-expression, and our human identity as self-created. Subjectivism rules, ironically putting us at risk of being controlled by powerful others. If God does not determine our reality, then we will be defined and controlled by human delusion. This conflict between the left and the right over the nature of self, of reality, of human beings, the family, and living freely according to God's objective design, not the determination of others, is the heart of the culture war. My conflict with Ali and his band of abusive followers was in this general context. A culture war in which my relationship with my husband was being maliciously maligned, redefined, mischaracterized, and labeled as perverted and even abusive. This was more than a mere reaction to a misunderstood tweet about a basketball game. This was clearly purposeful, as thousands of direct messages and tweets focused their hostility on heterosexuality and masculinity in general, and not just my particular situation. Buckley observed that when you ignore these kinds of personal attacks, which are also political in nature and part of a larger culture war, you have weakened your moral position. These attacks should generate righteous indignation among conservatives because they have serious implications. They must be called out, shut down, and not indulged or soothed. Yet they rarely are when opposition is from homosexuals. In this case, conservatives stunningly applauded and praised Ali, who is on the opposing side of the culture war, an inciter of mob behavior to hound a conservative female writer. While they are right to criticize my reactionary tweet, they were wrong in lacking indignation of Ali's and other writers' behavior throughout the previous week. Blinded by the fog of fear that they would be associated with a perceived homophobe, they lost sight of who was on their side. They fell for the labeling tactic and fed the ideological beast. In his long explanation, Esquire, of what happened during his debate with Vidal, Buckley quoted C.S. Lewis from his Reflections on the Psalms addressing the issue of righteous indignation. Lewis wrote, "The higher the stakes, the greater the temptation to lose your temper." And he's right. Those issues, those causes, those defenses of the ones we love that stir profound passions within us drive us to stumble in anger because our righteous indignation is stirred. The presence of faulty anger, however, should not blind us to the presence of righteous indignation. Some things are worth getting angry about, even if we fail badly in the execution. If we don't, then what are our priorities? Lewis wrote, "Thus, the absence of anger, especially that sort of anger which we call indignation, can, in my opinion, be a most alarming symptom. And the presence of indignation may be a good one. Even when that indignation passes into bitter personal vindictiveness, it may still be a good symptom, though bad in itself. It is a sin, but it shows that those who commit it have not sunk below the level at which the temptation to that sin exists. Just as the sins, often quite appalling, of the great patriot or great reformer point to something in him above mere self. If the Jews cursed more bitterly than the pagans, this was, I think, at least in part, because they took right and wrong more seriously. For if we look at the railings, we find they are usually angry, not simply because these things have been done to them, but because these things are manifestly wrong, or hateful to God as well as to the victim." Lewis is right. But in our culture, anger, indignation, shut down. You can't express those emotions. Conservatives, people who believe in right and wrong and watch the culture before us in dismay, feel silent because if we speak, we know our passion rises. It's been like that with the Me Too movement and other things in defending men. The anger at the guilty until proven innocent. Think of Kavanaugh in his hearing. He was angry. He was angry at being falsely accused of abusing. People mocked him. Look, he's angry. He's not self-controlled. Shut him down. No, he had a right to be angry. We had a right to be angry. It's called righteous indignation. Do we sometimes really mess up in that? Yes, we do. But if you're not angry, what are you standing for? Buckley severely rebuked fellow writers and editors who ridiculed him for his outbursts without being indignant about Vidal or accounting for context. He wondered how supposedly insightful people could think it, quote, irrelevant to specify what it was that catalyzed the scarcely controlled ferocity. Would his critics have kept their cool in the same circumstances? In my case, would any other female writer who'd been relentlessly attacked for a week on false assumptions and then helplessly watch as her husband was accused falsely of being an abuser, would they have escaped the temptation of anger? Maybe, maybe not. When you're facing false accusations, a lot of people like to say, oh, the more angry you are, the guilty you are. Not always. Not always. Sometimes you're really just angry because you feel helpless. The beginning of the week with the View thing, I was being accused of being a faithless friend, of being a traitor to someone I barely knew, based on a wrong understanding of a tweet. And then my husband falsely accused because wrong understanding of a tweet, or actually I think they rightly understood it and used it to manipulate. And then the mob came. This is why you need to understand context. Look at the cause of things and not just look at the effect. Some might say that being called a Nazi on television, like happened with Buckley, is worse than suffering a horde of crazed people on Twitter with an agenda, many of whom had verified accounts. But this belies the power of social media, which is evident by the manifold reactions throughout the media to my single tweet. And I want to remind you that I've read conservatives. I know conservatives who wrote weeping articles about when a porn actress committed suicide after she had been attacked by the media mob. We need to take this seriously no matter who it happens to. We're not all super strong. We all have our struggles. We all have our emotional things that we deal with. I've already shared mine, having PTSD from childhood abuse and others in the future, surrounding a religious institution, by the way. We need to take care about what's being said and what's the context. And yeah, maybe don't put yourself out there personally on the internet. That's wise, and the lesson I've learned. But to ignore it and to shove it off as inconsequential is wrong. You know, people say I should have just ignored the onslaught and the personal attacks, the death threats, and all of it. I didn't, obviously. Hence the guilt over my anger of allowing myself to be triggered by that hate. But like Buckley said, context does matter, and to refuse to consider circumstance is to be a reductionistic ideologue, something I thought principled conservatives weren't. You know, as with Buckley, I made the fatal flaw of not only getting angry and using crude language. It wasn't that. Conservatives do it all the time. But focusing my ire on a homosexual. Let's be honest, that's what it was. Had I been in an argument with an adulterer, a Trump supporter, porn addict, maligning my husband in the same way and said, hey, you're not living as your designed purpose as God created you, but you're seeking meaning in a woman's vagina, I wouldn't have been fired. I wouldn't have had countless articles written about me. You know it. It was my harsh reaction to a gay man. That was the line I crossed, and I would have still paid the price, you know, even if I hadn't used the vulgar phrase. This leads me to my final point, and one that will be most controversial, because it speaks to the fate of conservatism in the culture war. Some people would advise that I drop this whole line of discussion, but I can't in good conscience. If I'm going to fight in the culture war, I have to face the conflict head on and not run from it because it's uncomfortable or because I've been wrongly labeled. If having an offensive view, something you disagree with, or discussing a topic that makes you uncomfortable, that means I should be silent, even if I've said it to a friend of yours, making my case. In the words of my good friend Ben Domenech, in a post he wrote explaining why the Federalist publishes unpopular, alternative, and even unsavory views, he wrote, "For those of you who have a problem with this, the question is simple. What are you afraid of?" I have to ask the same thing of a mob. What were all of you so afraid of in my one tweet? So afraid of my defense of masculinity. So afraid when I described, however crudely, a homosexual relationship and challenged that he didn't know his design as a human being, as a man, sexually. What are you afraid of? You know, when Donald Trump became the Republican candidate, conservatives howled about it. They were afraid of being labeled by merely associating with him. "He's unfit, he's immoral," they cried, scurrying from him like ants from a poked anthill. At the time, I was one of the few conservative writers who stood up and urged my fellow Republicans to ignore the labels and to remember who the true enemy is and to forgive his rumored sins. Which I don't think he even stood up and said, "Hey, look, I'm so great at being, paying off porn actresses or whatever." Many turned around to support him, but many didn't. Most continued to condemn and be righteously horrified by his presumed sexual immorality. We see it every day, don't we? Conservatives see it as a liability in the culture war, and they ask, how can we have a leader who is so immoral represent us, those of us fighting for what is principled right and true? Democrats, of course, love this, and they jump on it. And in a stunning display of double standards, Pete Buttigieg, the gay Democratic mayor from Indiana running for president, ridiculed Christians who support Trump, saying their hypocrisy is unbelievable. Trump, he said on Meet the Press, acts in a way that's not consistent with anything I hear in scripture or church. I can't believe that somebody who was caught up writing hush money checks to an adult film actress is somebody they should be lifting up as the kind of person you want to be leading this nation. Oh, really, Pete? What about the blatant sin of homosexuality? Why do critics of Trump's immorality so openly approve of homosexuality? Why are principled conservatives so willing to condemn one sin but not the other? I'm not speaking to Democrats here. I'm talking to conservatives. I'm not asking this of those moral relativists and libertines who deny objective truth and values. This is not the time to convince them of the immorality of homosexuality, if they can even be convinced. I'm talking to principled conservatives, moral libertarians, who believe in God, believe in some measure of objective truth, Christians, talking to you. I'm talking to Jewish people who are committed to the scriptures and seek the holiness of Yahweh. Homosexuality is just as much a sin as adultery, with its corruption of God's design for relationships. Homosexuality is a broken covenant with God, just as adultery is a broken covenant between spouses. How can we wage a culture war, yet ignore the sin of homosexuality, call it normal and good, and even malign and reject and silence those who state it as such? I know of no one who saying adultery, payoffs to sex workers, or porn addiction is good. No one. No one's saying that stuff should be celebrated. No one's saying that all those people should be a protected identity group. I think adultery and pornography are great evils. Yet I know of conservatives who call homosexuality moral, or at least inconsequential in the battle for our culture. Most applaud it. One of the greatest threats to our freedom, our society, is the reconstruction of God's design for humanity and sexuality. Women can be men can be women, men can have sex with men, women can have sex with women. It's all turned upside down. The acceptance, not the mere tolerance, but the approval and glorification of homosexuality and now transgenderism undermines everything conservatives say they believe about human relations, existence, morality, and truth. God designed males and females for a purpose, and it's not to have sex with the same sex. That is a perversion of God's purpose. And any culture that glorifies it is degrading itself. This is not a homophobic statement. It's truth. Leviticus 18:22 says, "Men shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination." Why? Because it's contrary to God's objective design for humanity, for individuals. We're all born with all kinds of pathologies in our head. Just ask me, I'm Irish in my descent. My nature rages. But I can't act on it always. And when I do, it's sinful. We are fallen human beings. We live in a fallen world. We have to fight and battle the desires of our flesh that are contrary to God's design purpose for us. Not because he wants us to live in cages, but because he wants us to be free from the cages of our own making. Some would say the Bible doesn't oppose homosexuality because the word isn't in it. That's as ridiculous as saying God approves of killing the unborn because the word abortion is never mentioned. Yeah, and I've heard that argument before. The Bible is clear by its creation mandate regarding human sexuality and relations in the natural order, by Old Testament moral law, and by New Testament teaching. In Romans, it says, for this reason, God gave them over in his punishment to degrading passions. For their women had exchanged natural function for that which was unnatural. And the same also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire to one another, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. Living according to the image of God within us is fundamental to our humanity. God's purpose is also so clear in nature, as even evolutionary psychologists and secular scientists understand that males and females are physically constructed to have sex with the opposite sex so the species can survive and thrive. The natural realm dictates the normalcy of heterosexuality, not homosexuality. My criticism of Ali, however crudely put, and it was rooted in truth about God's design for human beings. You can accuse me of vulgarity and anger, but not bigotry. Bigotry is an evil derived from flawed human assumptions and opinions, not from truth. As a gay man, Ali is not living according to his design purpose regarding his sexuality. That's a statement of truth. Yet he had the gall to criticize me and my comments about a healthy male-female relationship presented in a lighthearted manner. While I deserve the backlash for my obnoxious wording and my anger, and I am ashamed of it, so don't worry, I am, and I suffer because of it, and deservedly so. What true conservative can speak against the essence of what I wrote in light of God's purpose for sexuality? Yet they have. At least those in some parts of the conservative media. Ironically, Milo, who's gay, wrote, he understood I wasn't being bigoted. He understood this is my beliefs. Another homosexual wrote at the Washington Examiner, I think. The same thing. What I said wasn't bigotry. They saw it for what it was. Yet, oddly, conservative writers, Christians, Jews, share the same scriptures, saw it as just pure bigotry, when it wasn't. It was anger. Why are they blind to this? What's going on in some of this conservative media that makes them blind to this? I think it's because they have allowed their personal relationships with homosexual friends to dilute their values. And I know it's hard. It's hard when you have homosexuals in your family and among your friends, to tell them, to say, I love you, but what you're doing is wrong. That's hard to do. It's hard to still stand by people when they sin. I do. I try to. Whether they've committed adultery, whether they've done whatever they've done. I don't write them off. I try not to. I don't want people writing me off because I sin. I've stood by friends through the worst things that they've done before. Held their hand through it. Not approving, not saying, well, what you're doing is great, awesome. No, what you're doing is wrong and you know it. But I'm here with you. I'm going to stand with you because I love you. So I'm not talking about abandoning anyone. But I think too many conservatives have saturated themselves in a pop culture that glorifies homosexuality. And like the old guard Republicans who are terrified of the label of racism, and remember they were also terribly embarrassed by the Christians who were pro-life, this new crop of conservatives, they're proud of being pro-life, but they're terrified of being called homophobic. They're ashamed of the people on the right who still think homosexuality is a sin. It's the most effective label to use against conservatives today, especially younger ones, to delegitimize them and deplatform them and silence them. Instead of fighting that, they run from it, bearing the brand of straight guilt all the way into irrelevancy. Refusing to bow to the homosexual agenda does not mean homosexuals should be abused or shunned or lose their freedom, their rights as human beings, or treated with disdain. I am not calling for government intervention of any sort. This is a cultural issue, a personal issue, a moral issue to be addressed within civil society and not in halls of power. I am for freedom from political constraint. This is also something that should be handled with grace. Homosexuality is just one sin. Sexual sins are not the only sins human beings commit, though we tend to be a whole lot more dramatic about them because sex is so fun and such a powerful aspect of human identity. We all sin in a variety of ways, and to act self-righteous when discussing homosexuality is hypocrisy. Gluttony, lying, getting drunk all the time, gossiping, big sins among the media. Those two are sins, and they wreak a great bit of havoc. But the fact that we are all sin does not mean we ignore sin or legitimize some sin over other sins. Homosexuality is wrong. But we are still called to love the person who has sinned and hate that sin. We should treat the person with grace, but be honest about it. We should forgive, show gentleness, and reject any form of abuse. I, of course, failed to show that gentleness to Ali. And I have personally apologized to him for that, but I will not apologize for criticizing homosexuality and pointing out that homosexuals, many of them today, root their identity in their sexual behavior, not their sex or their humanity as designed by God. This is why loving the person who sins and hating the sin is a trap for those who believe homosexuality is a sin. Do you see what I'm saying? If the sinner himself identifies himself as the sin, that's their identity mark, then to hate the sin is perceived as hating the sinner. This is how criticism of homosexuality is always taken. It's taken as hatred for the man or woman and not for their false identity and their sin. As long as conservatives flee from the label of homophobia and continue not only to approve of homosexuality, but to glorify it, celebrate it, and embrace it, their efforts to change the culture will be in vain. They will lose the war because their moral authority will be continually weakened as one of the most powerful identity groups today, the LGBT, brandishes vice as virtue and uses it as a weapon against conservatives. To put it in biblical terms, the sinful will permanently seize moral authority from the righteous. It takes bravery to stand up to that which is unpopular. To be honest, it doesn't take much courage as a conservative these days to be pro-life or pro-gun. Really, and it doesn't take a lot of courage anymore to defy the racism labels in today's anti-PC climate. With Trump's defiant example in this and lots of conservatives really fighting against it, me being one of them, conservatives have been emboldened to thumb their noses at efforts to stigmatize them as racist. I'm not saying it's not difficult fighting for life and in our Second Amendment rights and all this. It's hard. The opposition is loud, obnoxious, and sometimes threatening. But these issues are mostly supported by the conservative community, and there's power in that unity. This isn't true of homosexuality, which has been immortalized as a marginalized identity group oppressed by straight people. When it comes to challenging homosexual groupthink, the mob wins almost every time. personal associations with outspoken homosexuals, business partnerships, personal relationships. Conservatives don't want to offend. Then there's the cool factor of embracing homosexuality and conflating the plight of homosexuals with that of blacks. All of it plays into straight guilt. And so the leftist mob using homosexuality as a cudgel reigns victorious in this Marxist struggle, and the culture continues to decline. Homosexuals, like feminists, have latched onto the legacy of Black power. Though sharing no history with blacks who suffered slavery merely for the color of their skin, gays demand to be seen as the new blacks, with the rights of restitution and power demanded by blacks, using the same tactics to control political opposition. And it works because conservatives cower. Have homosexuals suffered unjustly in the past by their parents and society, the rights not being recognized, and how society has hypocritically shunned one sin while openly embracing others? Yes, they have. We don't make light of that. I've written about that before. The love we show and the grace we should show. I have. At the Federalist. But a society struggling with how to handle personal sin and perversion cannot be compared to a society that enslaved the innocent. Feminists can't compare themselves to blacks, and neither can homosexuals. This doesn't mean the sinner should be ostracized. The improvement we've made in our treatment of homosexuals and tolerance of homosexuality in this regard has been greatly needed. But we have moved way past the line of truth. Instead of treating people who sin with grace and accepting those who choose to act on their homosexual desires as complex human beings, not to be defined solely by their sin, we are bowing to the will of the homosexual mob that identifies itself by its sexual choices and uses that power to advance anti-freedom political agendas. The fate of conservatism in the culture war hinges on how it deals with moral issues. There are many, but it includes homosexuality. And that's a big part of it because it's an agenda bent on anti-freedom policies. As long as conservatives embrace it, rather than simply promoting tolerance and grace, as long as they silence their own, even in moments of excessive bitchiness, and as long as they allow personal relationships with homosexuals to weaken their moral fortitude, the efforts of quote-unquote principled conservatives, their efforts to save the culture will fail.